She was perfection carved in colorless celluloid. A face so arresting it stopped conversations mid-sentence. Gene Tierney had everything: fame, wealth, beauty that belonged in dreams, and the favor of every camera she faced. She glided through Hollywood like a ghost in silk, untouched by the chaos she often portrayed. But the world she lived in did not match the one on screen. In 1943, she greeted a fan at a Hollywood canteen, unaware the woman had escaped quarantine for rubella just to meet her. Gene was pregnant. Months later, her daughter was born blind, deaf, and severely disabled. The glamour shattered. Her soul cracked. And no studio lighting could fix what was broken inside her. In the years that followed, she would disappear into private wars, hospitalizations, shock therapy, and a diagnosis that stripped away every illusion: bipolar disorder. The public saw the beauty. They never saw the battle. This is the untold story of Gene Tierney. Throughout the late 40s, she commanded the screen in film after film: The Razor's Edge, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, Night and the City. Whether she was playing a tragic romantic, a haunted widow, or a poised society woman, she exuded a cool grace that never cracked. There were no theatrics, no overreach. She was the storm before the sound. The media labeled her the Get Girl, a title that underscored her allure. Men in power wanted her in their films, in their headlines, in their lives. But Gene wasn't merely ornamental. She was intelligent, articulate, fluent in French, and known for her sharp wit and self-possession. Behind the gowns and studio portraits stood a woman who understood her image, and used it carefully. She wasn't a firework like Bette Davis, nor a tempest like Joan Crawford. Gene Tierney was a mirage, cool, contained, with a sadness flickering just beneath the surface. She represented something rare in Hollywood: beauty without bravado, vulnerability without collapse. It was that contradiction that drew people to her, even when they couldn't explain why. By the end of the 1940s, she had become a fixture in the firmament of film stars. Her name carried weight. Her face, immortalized on posters and magazines, was instantly recognizable. She was what every young actress wanted to become, and what every studio tried to replicate. To the public, Gene Tierney was the embodiment of Hollywood perfection. But beneath that porcelain surface, a quiet fracture was growing. When Gene Tierney appeared on screen, it was as if the air stilled. The camera didn't just love her, it worshipped her. Her eyes were green glass glowing under studio lights, her cheekbones sculpted like marble, and her voice, calm and poised, whispered of elegance untouched by time. She didn't have to speak to dominate a scene, she only had to exist. Born into privilege in Brooklyn in 1920, Gene Eliza Tierney was raised to be refined. Her father, a successful insurance broker, believed in her so deeply that he created an entire corporation to finance her stage career. She was educated in the finest American schools and polished in a Swiss finishing school. It was a childhood steeped in etiquette, culture, and expectation, a life as carefully arranged as a film set. Broadway noticed her first. In What a Life! And Mrs. O'Brien Entertains, critics called her the most beautiful water carrier ever seen, then watched her bloom into roles worthy of her poise. But Hollywood was always waiting. And when studio mogul Darryl F. Zanuck saw her on stage in The Male Animal, he didn't hesitate. She was offered a contract with 20th Century Fox. Overnight, she was no longer a debutante playing at art, she was a rising force in the dream factory. Her early film appearances were a slow build. Hudson's Bay, The Return of Frank James, and Sundown showed a woman who could play innocence, strength, even mystery. But it was Laura in 1944 that transformed her from actress to icon. As Laura Hunt, the murder victim whose portrait seduces a detective, Gene Tierney was haunting, composed, unforgettable. The film didn't just succeed. It became legend. And so did she. In Leave Her to Heaven, 1945, she played Ellen, a woman whose love was so obsessive, it destroyed those closest to her. It was a role that demanded subtle menace cloaked in beauty, and she delivered it with devastating precision. The Academy noticed. She was nominated for Best Actress. Even though she didn't win, Hollywood had made up its mind. Gene Tierney wasn't just another pretty face, she was dangerous, complex, magnetic. The world saw grace. But her memories were shaped by silence. Gene Tierney's childhood was cloaked in privilege, but it was also rigid, controlled, an environment of expectations rather than affection. Her father ran their household like a boardroom, exacting and proud, while her mother imposed elegance with military precision. She learned to curtsy before she learned to cry. Emotions were dressed up and tucked away, just like the gloves she wore to dinner. At finishing school in Switzerland, Gene discovered solitude and structure in equal measure. Her days were dictated by lessons in etiquette, posture, language, and restraint. Her beauty set her apart, but so did her discipline. She learned to move through life as though it were a performance, always composed, always correct. That training would serve her well in Hollywood. But it also left her unequipped for chaos. And then came 1943. She was 3 months pregnant when she made an appearance at the Hollywood Canteen, a volunteer-run venue where stars met servicemen and civilians. It was meant to be a night of goodwill. A fan approached her, warm, excited, sick. The woman had just broken quarantine from a rubella outbreak. Days later, Gene began to feel uneasy. The doctors confirmed the unthinkable: she had contracted the virus while carrying her child. When her daughter, Daria, was born, the prognosis was grim. She was blind. She was deaf. She would never speak. Never understand. For Jean, the news detonated something inside her that would never fully heal. She tried to continue as if nothing had happened. The public saw her smile at premieres, read her name in gossip columns, clipped her photos from movie magazines. But privately, she was unraveling. The guilt consumed her. She blamed herself for working while pregnant, for shaking hands with a stranger, for not stopping fate when she had no power to do so. Hollywood gave her distractions, roles, attention, applause. But none of it reached the wound. She began experiencing long stretches of numbness, followed by storms of despair. She couldn't sleep. Couldn't focus. Some days, she couldn't speak without trembling. She had vanished from the screen as quietly as she once entered it. For years, Gene Tierney had been the mirror Hollywood admired itself in, flawless, composed, incandescent. But now, that mirror was cracked. Her diagnosis, the public silence, the hospitalizations, none of it fit the narrative the studios had built. And so, Jean did what many stars of her era never dared: she tried to rewrite her own story. The 1950s had forgotten her. Offers dried up. Photographers stopped calling. She was no longer the get girl, no longer the studio's muse. She was, simply, Jean, broken, uncertain, and looking for a way back. But a return to fame meant creating a new kind of illusion, not one of perfection, but of survival. She began with her appearance. The gowns became simpler. The makeup, once calculated to flatter every angle, now softened. Her voice, once rehearsed to deliver lines like velvet, now carried the weight of real silence. There was no need to pretend anymore. She had lived the roles that once felt like fiction. Her first steps back were cautious. In 1962, after a 7-year absence, she returned in Advise and Consent. The performance was quiet, measured, but magnetic. She wasn't the Gene Tierney of the 40s, and that was the point. There was something raw in her stillness now, a woman who didn't need to prove anything to the lens. She let the audience come to her. But Hollywood had changed. The golden age was gone. The studios that once curated her image had shifted their gaze to younger, louder stars. And Jean? Jean had lost interest in being curated. She turned down roles that felt dishonest. She refused to be airbrushed into nostalgia. She would only return on her terms. Off-screen, the reinvention was harder. Her mental health remained fragile, swinging between long periods of calm and sudden descents into shadow. She worked with doctors who understood her better than those who once shocked her into silence. She became an advocate. Not loudly, but by existing. In a time when mental illness was a career death sentence, she chose not to hide. She also wrote. In 1979, Gene published her memoir, Self-Portrait, a title as defiant as it was revealing. The book was unflinching. She spoke of her daughter's disability, her suicide attempt, her years in institutions, the shame, the pain, the raw terror of not trusting her own mind. But she also wrote of love, of resilience, of quiet mornings that didn't need applause to feel complete. It wasn't a reinvention in the Hollywood sense. She didn't change her name. She didn't fake a comeback. Instead, Gene reintroduced herself as a human being, someone who had been idolized, discarded, and still found her way back to the surface. Not as a star, but as a survivor. Her legacy began to shift. No longer just the tragic beauty of Laura, or the icy possessiveness of Leave Her to Heaven. Now, she was remembered as a woman who dared to tell the truth about a life that looked perfect from the outside but was anything but. She remarried later in life. Found peace in quiet places. And while she never again reached the dizzying heights of her youth, she no longer needed to. She had nothing left to prove. Gene Tierney remade herself not into a legend, but into something far rarer, a real person. She was diagnosed with manic depression. In those days, there was little understanding, even less compassion. The treatments were invasive, the language clinical. She underwent electroconvulsive therapy, sometimes daily. It left her dazed, confused, missing pieces of her own memory. She described it later as a fog I couldn't step out of. Her mind, once a fortress of poise and clarity, became a battlefield. The press said little. The studios said less. In an era where weakness could end a career, Gene's disappearance was covered in silence. She was no longer a star. She was a cautionary tale whispered behind closed studio doors. But even in her darkest moments, something in her refused to die. She wrote. She painted. She walked alone through hospital gardens, trying to remember who she had been before the applause. And slowly, painfully, she began to return. But nothing was the same. Her career would never fully recover. The parts became smaller. The calls rarer. When she did return. In Advise and Consent, 1962, in The Pleasure Seekers, 1964, she was brilliant, but the world had moved on. Hollywood had fallen for new faces, new tragedies. Gene Tierney had reached the top, and watched it vanish. Yet what remained wasn't failure. It was endurance. Her story didn't end with a final scene or a last great performance. It unfolded in quiet chapters, letters, memoirs, a life reclaimed in fragments. She found peace not in cameras, but in quiet mornings and family dinners. In visits to her daughter. In the strange, fragile joy of simply surviving. She had once been Hollywood's most luminous star. But even the brightest lights burn out. For a brief, glittering moment, Gene Tierney was the woman Hollywood couldn't look away from. The velvet curve of her voice, the impossible balance of softness and strength in her gaze, she didn't act like others. She suggested. She withheld. And in that restraint, she became irresistible. From Laura to Leave Her to Heaven, she redefined what it meant to be a leading lady. She wasn't simply the object of desire, she was the enigma. A mystery wrapped in elegance, layered with quiet danger. Her performances were cool fire, burning slow but deep. In The Razor's Edge, she moved with emotional gravity. In The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, she made loneliness look poetic. By the late 1940s, Gene Tierney was at the summit of fame. Every magazine wanted her. Every director courted her. Her name drew crowds. Her face sold films. But the camera never showed what waited when the lights dimmed. Behind the closed doors of her dressing room, the exhaustion began to show. She was still mourning the child she couldn't truly mother. The nights were getting longer. Her emotions, once controlled with the grace of a ballet dancer, began slipping through the cracks. Her marriage to fashion designer Oleg Cassini was crumbling. Once a glamorous union of Hollywood and haute couture, it became another casualty of grief and distance. The miscarriage of joy between them widened into silence. Their second child, Christina, brought light, but not enough to outshine the shadows. Affairs followed, each one more fragile than the last. She was loved, often, but never quite saved. In public, she played the role, perfect as ever. But off-screen, Gene began to vanish. The weight of expectation, of image, of pretending she was fine, became unbearable. Then came the collapse. In the early 1950s, she disappeared from a film set. No explanation. No scandal. Just gone. She checked herself into the Menninger Clinic, one of the nation's most prestigious psychiatric hospitals. There, in stark white rooms far from the movie lots of California, Gene began a brutal journey into the depths of mental illness. She didn't die young. She didn't vanish in scandal or overdose or fire. Gene Tierney lived, quietly, defiantly, for 70 years. She aged without spectacle. She loved without headlines. She survived. In the end, it wasn't the roles that defined her, but the resilience between them. She became one of the first Hollywood actresses to speak openly about mental illness, decades before it became safe to do so. Her memoir, Self-Portrait, wasn't a vanity project. It was an act of courage, offering herself, unvarnished, to a world that once demanded only perfection. She taught us that beauty doesn't shield pain. That elegance can coexist with torment. And that even the most luminous faces can hide the darkest storms. She was the woman who once embodied Hollywood's ideal, and then broke free from it, scarred but whole. Gene Tierney died in 1991, from emphysema, just shy of her 71st birthday. No red carpet marked her passing. No studio tribute filled the airwaves. But for those who knew her story, her legacy lingers, not as a cautionary tale, but as a quiet triumph. In the end, she didn't fade. She endured. And in doing so, she left behind something far more powerful than fame. Truth.